Hello and welcome to the Immigrant in Corporate podcast. My guest today is Victoria Shiroma Wilson, EDD. Victoria is passionate about empowering others to design sustainable strategies towards transformation that is in alignment with their values, cultural identities, and unique dreams. Growing up biracial at the intersection of multiple distinct cultures, languages, and nationalities, adds dimension and lived authority to Victoria's understanding of societal dynamics and the importance of understanding how one's unique voice can be a competitive advantage in today's interconnected world. To feed our insatiable curiosity, Victoria earned a doctorate from the University of Southern California. She serves as an executive coach for socially conscious leaders and design courses on identity, culture, career, and leadership. Victoria is one of the amazing women that shared their stories in my book, Thriving in Intersectionality. And she shares insights from her experiences working within corporate America. Hello, and welcome to the Immigrant in Corporate podcast. On this podcast, you will learn from lived experiences how to thrive in the corporate workplace as an immigrant. My name is Lola Adeyemo. I am the CEO of EQI Mindset and the founder of the nonprofit Immigrants in Corporate Inc. I work with organizations to build inclusive workplaces. On this podcast, I will be amplifying immigrant voices from within corporate organizations through solo episodes as well as guest interviews. It is a global world of work, and I'm very sure you can learn a thing or two from my guests who are originally from different parts of the world and their experiences working in the corporate workplace. Hi, Victoria. Welcome to the Immigrant in Corporate podcast, and thanks for joining me today.
Oh my goodness, Lola, I'm so happy to be here.
And it's been a journey for you and I, and we'll get to that in a little bit because part of the project for me that launched this podcast is my book. And you also had a similar book that you featured me and I featured you in my book because we have similar topic and passion. So I'm excited that, it's almost like we've been on this train for a long time.
Yes, we
And
have. Yes, and I feel like our adventure is just beginning in a sense.
exactly, because I can't say it's coming to an end. It really is just
Yeah,
beginning. Yeah, yeah.
exactly.
So I'm excited to document an official conversation for my podcast audience with you,
Great.
even though you do have a little bit of your story in my upcoming book, Thriving in Intersectionality. So if you could start by giving us a little bit of your background, what's your immigration story?
Yeah, and so in many ways, I've had this really unique experience coming to the United States. My situation, I would say, is unique, but then at the same time, it followed this typical trajectory of an immigrant story. And depending on somebody's perspective, they might see like a lot of similarities and it might resonate with their own stories or might be slightly different. But I can share with you a little bit about just overall like what brought me here, right? So I actually spent my childhood. I was born and raised in Japan. I'm biracial. My father is Japanese. My mother is American. So even living in this country that I spent all of my childhood in, I was always kind of perceived as an outsider. But during that time, I also went to an American high school, and I had American friends. Right, and I just remember at that time in growing up, I mean, they would always talk about how wonderful America was, especially since they had this wonderful creation called malls that I had never experienced before. You know, growing up in like this little island here, and but when I came to the United States, I came to the United States for the first time when I was in university. You know, to attend university, I would say, and I was I went from a semi-tropical island, tiny little island with maybe about 1 million people total population, to the Midwest. Right, I was in Wisconsin, and I went from just balmy weather to just bitter cold. Right, but what was really interesting about that experience for me, and I can only say in hindsight, I see how it kind of followed this typical immigrant journey, because I was dropped into the middle of the Midwest and I immediately experienced tremendous culture shock. Right. And even though I did have the privilege and the advantages of like speaking English with a Midwestern accent, what was going on inside of me was just like, I really was having a hard time reading culturally what was going on around me. Um,
Right.
I really had a hard time like interacting with the people around me. And the other thing that, I mean, in hindsight, I realized is that all the Americans that I encountered were in Japan, right? At, when I was growing up. So
Right.
they had the experience of immigrating, right? And so they could kind of understand those nuances. But when I went to the United States, I was confronted with people who had never even left their small towns.
Right.
Right. So how I interacted with them and how they interacted with me came up with like a number of challenges
Right.
overall.
Right. And where you grew up, from your perspective growing up, you thought, this is pretty diverse. I'll be fine, right? You grew up, what part of Japan did you grow up?
I grew up on an island called Okinawa. So there's a
Okinawa.
large US military population there. But then you also realize that there's so many cultures even within the United States, right? So
Right.
I got to meet people from all over the United States. And it was a very much an integrated society with the military, right? So then you go to some place like where you're in the Midwest, and it's like, wow, you don't have maybe that perspective. Like a lot of the people that I encountered just didn't have the perspective of understanding that there was this world outside of the state, let
Right.
alone world outside of the United States.
Right. So you had more exposure back
Yes.
home than you
Yes.
did when you came to the United States. And
Yes.
that's important because for me, one of the things that I talk about is I thought I spoke English and I've watched Hollywood movies, so I'm
Hmm.
fine. We
Hmm.
have all of these ideas that it's not really until you get in there.
Right.
And depending on where you go, right? What part of the
Hmm.
country you go, your experience will also be different.
Yeah. Well, and I think the other thing that again, looking back on it, I can see with clarity now that I didn't see at the time was that I really did have the same experiences like an international student did, right? But I wasn't classified as an international student, just because through my mother I had citizenship. But
Ah,
when I came to the United States and then I was going and I was just struggling my first year, with all the different cultures, or just this new culture that I was just immersed in, I think I could have benefited from like having the knowledge to seek out maybe the International Student Organization or something
right.
like that,
Okay.
because with those resources. So that's one thing I would say is like seek out those resources if you can.
Right. I didn't even know that piece, right? When you were talking about coming into school, I'm
Hmm.
thinking, oh, international student as resources. But you're
Right.
right. You didn't come in as an international student. You came in as a
I
resident.
w- so, and of course, going to a big state school like Wisconsin, I was, it was just kind of a check in the box. So I was
Right.
classified as a domestic student. So, they thought, oh, well, the months you move into your dorm, you're done. But then that's when
Right.
my challenges began.
Right. So did you eventually discover that you needed the international student office, or is this something that is was only advertised for the
Yeah.
international student?
So at the time, it was something that was only advertised for the international students, right? And so I think about now, knowing who I am many decades later, I think I would have benefited. Like if I had known that, I probably should have just sought those resources out.
Absolutely. And I think the points you're making is important because um I had not thought about it from the perspective you did, right? So I've spoken with a lot of people that came in from other countries through the school route. And it's usually, the school experience is way better than the school integration experience is better than corporate America integration.
Yes.
And it's because of exactly what you said. The international students office acknowledges that you're coming from somewhere else, and so they provide support for you from that perspective. But what happens when I'm an immigrant because I moved from somewhere else, I grew up somewhere else, but technically I'm not, an international student by legal classification.
Right. And I would say that the probably that population is bigger than one suspects, just due to the number of expatriates that
Yeah.
live all over the world, as well as military, as well as folks who just are like what they call third culture kids, like, and
Yeah.
they,
Yeah.
and we're just kind of this unique classification, but we don't have the numbers at any one institution that a lot of And I think there's more awareness around that now versus when I was at in university. But yeah, it was one of those. It was one of those struggles.
Yeah, and I think we would talk about that further too as we go into your entry into corporate America, how that relates, because I'll love to dive into how it compares with my experience coming into corporate America when it was a couple of months after graduation, but my status had already changed to green card. So
Mm-hmm.
legally, I didn't need the network, and I didn't have the network of other international students, other immigrants who were building a community and supporting each other, right?
Right, exactly. Yeah, my entry into corporate America was that's a whole nother story that I'm happy to share with
Okay,
you
let's
as
let's
well.
move there. I think that's the
Yeah,
next part. What was that like for you? How long did it take for the school, and then what was the process of getting into corporate America?
yeah, so I was one of those people that I thought I was going to actually end up in government service. And I remember going straight from undergraduate to graduate school on the East Coast and feeling like I'm going to be serving, the United States. And I ended up landing, I would say, my, what is it called, dream internship at the time with the State Department. And in hindsight, I think it would have been it would have been a great career to have. But in my young 20s, I was also, I would say, feeling like I wanted more of an adventure. Right. So through a number of twists and turns, I finished graduate school and actually moved out to California and started my official career in technology. And I realized that being in Silicon Valley, right, being in tech, that in of itself has its own culture, its own ecosystem, its own ethos, right, and its own hierarchy in terms of the ways you have to get things done. And I just remember, like, as I was getting started, I started in a number of startups, and I just remember, like, feeling though I had to assimilate pretty quickly. And again, you don't have those resources that, to ease your way into something. You have to hit the ground from the first day you're on the job, in a sense. So yeah, and in some respects, I felt like I couldn't really be myself. Like I actually had to turn on a side for myself that didn't come naturally to me. I had to be logical. I had to be, I actually had to be very direct in my communication. I had to feel like I had to be a lot more aggressive than I naturally am.
Yeah. And so, how did you end up on the West Coast? What
Um,
is the difference in that experience, right? The cultural,
yeah.
geographical culture within the US.
Well, coming from, I ended up getting a glimpse into government, right? And
Okay.
one of the main reasons why I decided to leave government is that as I was rounding out this internship experience, my mentor was just like, well, you're certainly welcome to pursue a career here, but somebody's going to have to retire or die before you can get a job here. And maybe in like 15 years, you can actually, get a promotion. And I was thinking to myself, and I have to admit, I wanted a calling and not a career. And I was feeling very impatient about it. Right. So my boyfriend, who became my husband later became my husband, actually said, "Hey, I'm moving out to California." He ended up getting a job in tech, so I followed him out there, and I had to like search, without any community, without any network to find something. And so yeah, it kind of an interesting process. It was just kind of like, I'll try anything. So I ended up, my first job was working at a startup in marketing. It was, yeah. And from there, I felt like I learned a lot, but it was also it didn't come very naturally in terms of like what I felt like my skill set was.
Right, right. Yeah, I mean, when we look at our stories, I just see a lot of parallel, and I also see a lot of what in the way we can see it now with our experience, we actually are privileged if we think about it, because similar to you, my husband was already living in California, and that was why I didn't look for a job in Texas. That's why I came to San Diego. So I pretty much left the community that I already had, and I came to this brand new city where I don't know anybody. I don't have a job lined up yet, and I'm job searching by myself, right? If I was still in Texas where I went to grad school, I could at least maybe still leverage some of the resources on my campus. Um, but again, I feel like it's also a privilege because I finished my degree in biotechnology, but I also knew I didn't want to be at the bench. So a lot of
Hmm.
the people in my program were trying to look for
Yeah.
jobs in the lab.
Yes. Yes.
and
Yeah.
I was trying to get into corporate, and San Diego is a biotech hub. There's a lot of companies here. So I think it's easy for us to look back and see all of these reasons why, we're privileged, we have opportunity. But the reason why these conversations are really important is because we don't know who else is out there that is kind of locked into something because of the environment, because of what you see, because of what you observe. And so yeah, so let's talk about that. Like being in the workplace, when you eventually switch to corporate America, based on
Hmm.
your background as
Hmm.
an immigrant, and then based on your experience in college,
Right.
let's unpack how that helped or didn't at work, right? What were some of
Yeah.
the challenges that you noticed at work?
So it's interesting. So one of the things that I had to confront, right, and in fact, it was definitely not a very linear process. It was a very messy process for me internally, right? It is the whole notion of what was it, the social contract that I thought existed. So for example, like one of the things I see a lot of my clients who I coach, one of the things that they struggle with is that there are these messages that you internalize through your entire life, right? And
Right,
some of the messages that I internalized that my parents would always say, like, you go to as good of a school as you can, you get a good job, and then everything else is going to like line up in life, right?
right,
And honestly, it didn't line up that cleanly for me, right? Because I was building my own self-awareness about like
right.
what it is that I wanted. And
To be
so,
fair, you could have stayed in government and had that. Remember, our parents in
yeah,
their time, you get a job and you stay there for
exactly.
a long time, right? Yeah,
Exactly. And it took a long time for me to realize that. So, then like looking at another, looking one layer down and understanding like what motivated my parents. My parents were kind of like, especially my father was that, he survived World War II, right? So being safe, being secure, having a secure paycheck was a big motivator for him. And also the world, like if you think about the post-war generation in Japan, it was all about sacrifice so that the
right,
next generation could really thrive, right,
right,
and get the basic material needs, right, that
right,
they didn't have growing up. And so that's the messages that I kept on internalizing. And so I felt for me, and I see this a lot with actually like a lot of my clients who have had similar situations, the stakes seem higher,
right,
right? It's like, gosh, they've sacrificed so much for me that I need to go and get a good job, have this good life so I can help,
right,
show them or anybody else that I've kind of made it. And so,
right.
yeah, that was always a
And
challenge.
yeah, and I think that's the danger, is that we don't feel like we have the luxury to explore where our passions are, like to find your voice or to find yourself. All of those things sounds like lazy terms. Like you just need to get a great job that pays well, work hard, and get paid.
Yeah, and I think it can also get wrapped up into logic, like So back to what you said, it's like it seems extravagant in a sense to say, well, there's some, I know that my skill set or my passions or my interests are elsewhere than what has been prescribed for me, right? But one of the things that I try to help people understand is that you can actually work with both of those contexts, right? And then so what's how do we design something for you that's going to work to preserve your relationships and then but at the same time help you thrive in the workplace.
Right, right. And we'll come back to your current work in a minute, because I think this is part of where the intersection of our work and our book kind
Mm-hmm.
of kicks in. But I want to
Yeah.
take you back into the corporate workplace, because I know you
Yeah.
had some pretty fun experiences around different areas,
Yeah.
leadership, hierarchy. Are there some
Right.
of those key areas that you want to discuss, or stories that you want to share around your experiences?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's a couple of stories that I can share, but I think the one thing that I mean, one where I think I started and I'm going to come back to is the whole notion of the social contract, right? So another thing that I internalized from my parents was specifically like, hey, somebody, if you work hard and do your best, then you're going to get rewarded for it. That was another kind of myth, I would say, that I internalized quite a bit. And so there, and I call it the myth of the benevolent manager. right? That, that if you work hard, then you're going to be recognized for it. Then your manager's going to, say, okay, you're ready for a promotion and things like that. And I think one of the things that we all, if you have that type of a manager, good for you. That's fantastic, right? Um, but for a lot of us, we didn't have that experience. Like it was never that perfect. So so I just remember like putting a lot of faith in my managers. And I just remember there were times I would say I had some managers that kind of misread me. Like they didn't understand me culturally. They didn't, and so I remember during a performance review, I had a manager tell me specifically, like, you have very low self confidence, and I was just like, first of all, this is a performance review.
Right.
you know, but rather than the character descriptions, and so that's so it was really fascinating to find, and as this manager was telling me, I apologized a couple of times because what there was a project that fell behind, and so what I did was I actually took the responsibility for the project. I thought I was demonstrating leadership qualities, right,
Mm,
by saying, hey, you know what, this was my fault. I take the responsibility for it, but and here's what I think we can do. But the fact that I apologized, according to that person, they interpreted that as a sign of weakness, right? And they felt like, well, you don't have self confidence if you're apologizing for your mistakes, right? And again, it took me a while to unpack that, but I think the conclusion that I've reached is that's a matter of perspective, right?
right.
What is considered strength versus weakness and all that. And I think that even in some environments that would be perceived as a strength, in other environments, obviously with the one I was in, it was perceived as
Right.
very much a weakness.
Right, right. And where the cultural background I think comes in is that you take these people and you look to them as, I need to listen to you. I need to believe what you say because you are a manager. So you are in a
Exactly.
position of authority, and there's just a different, culturally there's a different expectation with that
Yes.
dynamic.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that was another piece of culture that I did internalize as well. A cultural, assumptions that I internalized as well was the fact that, if that manager was there, they were there for a reason, right?
Right,
And I'd say that the society in which I came, managers have a very different level of responsibility too. It's like they are responsible for taking care of their folks, right? Again,
right,
a very different social contract from the one that I was in. So
right,
it was a
right.
very big learning experience for me.
You are turning all of those learnings into something that will be really helpful to other people in your situation, or that were in your situation at that time. So how did you transition? So, because that's another thing. So you were in corporate America, and now you are doing work that still impacts those in corporate America, those individuals. So tell us about what you are doing now, and how you got here.
Yeah, absolutely. So after a number of failed startups, there was one moment I actually had this epiphany. I was like, you know what? I really am passionate about helping people. And then, like when you have those moments of epiphany, those moments of clarity, then all of like the facts, just come and fall into place. I'm like, yeah, I was always the person that everybody was in my cube, a cubicle at work because they wanted to talk to me about like what was going on with their career or what was going, like how to navigate like a diplomatically tricky situation, or a politically tricky situation at work. And so I'm like, you know what? I want to actually dedicate more my professional life to helping others that way. So I went back to grad school. I ended up having getting my master's degree in counseling, and then I have my doctorate in education, and all around really like how to integrate like cultural identity into kind of like making positive change. So a lot of what I do is I work with multicultural leaders to really understand the full extent of like all the influences that their culture and identity, play in their leadership, and then how they can actually leverage that as a really positive thing
Right,
in the workplace.
right. And you do share some of those frameworks in your upcoming book, right?
I do, yes.
Can you tell us about that?
Yeah. So, and in fact, it's funny because, and I think you and I can laugh about how like the titles of our books have like evolved over the course of the last few months. But my final title is Exceptional Futures: The Power of Identity to Design Positive Change. And in it, there are these frameworks and these models for really being clear about like what's a guiding question like. And so for somebody, it could be like, how do I become a better leader? right? That could be your guiding question. And so I work through a number of like frameworks and exercises and elements to help you really get that clarity for yourself and understand what type of change you want to make, right? Whether it's within yourself, maybe within your team, or within a bigger system, and then put a plan of action together to be able to do it.
Right. Okay, well, we're looking forward to getting a copy of that. I'm looking forward to
Yeah.
my copy.
Yes, yes, I know. In a couple
I
of weeks, we're going
pre-ordered
to
it.
be.
Yep, I'm going to get it. But so if you look back at your experience within corporate America now not
Hmm.
from the perspective of the work you are doing now, which
Hmm.
is, you're packaging all of those experiences. If you look at your experience within corporate America, do you think, or how do you see that your background, the way you were raised, the environment you were raised, how do you think it helped you survive some of the scenarios you had there?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I was reflecting on that earlier. I do feel like what I do bring to the picture is I do have this, tremendous work ethic, right? I don't give up easily. And in fact, I think some people have called me tenacious in a good way as a result of that, right? Because I'm like, I'm not willing to just give up on a problem easily. And I think that my being a being an immigrant and having challenges around just integration was always like helped me along that path. I think the other thing is loyalty, right? The type of bonds that we form with others as immigrants is different, I would say, from something that's a little bit more transactional. So that was one of the things that I think hurt me a lot. Like I felt emotionally just sometimes bruised because sometimes others would have this like more of a transactional nature to working, the work relationship. But I always saw myself as being a little bit more like loyal, right? And it's
Right,
helped me and it's also challenged me in some ways, but I always prefer to see that as an asset.
right, right. Well, I think you've shared a lot with us. Thank you for sharing about just that. I think you opened my mind really to that different side of being an immigrant student, is what I'll call, not
Yes.
necessarily the typical classification that we use for
Hmm.
international students. And my new nonprofit, Immigrants Incorporate Inc., part of the things I want to do beyond my book
Hmm.
is also provide resources for international students
Yeah.
and immigrants in the workplace, as well as HR and recruiters in
Hmm.
corporate America. So I think you touched on something really important, which is how we classify people and then how we determine who gets what resources. Yeah,
Yes.
yeah,
Yes, absolutely. And I would also say that there's a lot, and my focus is on identity. There's this tendency to have like trying to have these neat descriptions,
right,
by putting labels on things. Like as an immigrant, you must have this experience. And to understand that the immigrant experience is so diverse, right?
yes,
And how we
very important.
see ourselves and see the world in terms of our own lens of identity is very
Right,
important in this whole process.
right, 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 and it's an important conversation to be having now. I think the work you're doing with identity and designing futures and what I'm doing with empowering immigrants in the workplace, I think it's all timely because we are talking of all of these diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives, and we're
Mhm.
trying to change systems and
Mhm.
change organizational culture, but it's also giving people a deeper understanding of what we're trying to do here. It's not putting people in neat little boxes. Every
Absolutely.
individual is going to be very different.
Yeah. And I think what I'll add to that is that for those organizations that want to move from a knowledge to an innovation based culture, right?
Mhm.
Um, really being able to understand and leverage the uniqueness of each of your employees is going to be your differentiating factor, right? Having people feel like they belong, having people feel like they can actually have a voice to be able
Right,
to help grow and develop new markets perhaps, or even develop new technologies. That's important. I think a lot of organizations are not tolerant of like what comes with it. There's this perception of messiness, right?
right,
That like, oh well, it's not unified. And I'm like, well, there was a generation of unification in that way, but that was also sometimes assimilation, right?
right,
And now we want
right,
to try to figure out how to leverage all these wonderful, unique perspectives because that's really where growth is going to happen.
right. Right. Thank you. All right. To wrap up, I like to ask a final question.
Okay. Yeah.
Well, two. Let's talk about the one first. Takeaways. If anybody in your situation, right, somebody moving from Okinawa from a mix, if you were to talk to your younger self now,
Hmm.
is there anything in terms of resources or advice or insight or final thoughts that you
Yeah,
would share?
yeah. I would say it's interesting because I think for those of us, if had to go back to my 19-year-old self or my 18-year-old self and to give myself some advice, and also anybody who's coming to America for the first time, I would just say, spend a little bit of time really investing in the relationships around you, right? Those, and then what I mean by that is not necessarily people who are exactly like you or come from the same place and all that, but people who really, really get you and respect really the potential that you have, right? And so it might take you out a little bit out of your comfort zone to be able to do that, but really investing in those relationships will be something that you can, that's like a foundation that you're going to build for life, right? um, I think the other thing that I will also say is build that awareness so that you can really be able to differentiate the kind of like the myths of the social contract from what the reality is. One of the things I always tell my clients is this whole notion of take a step back, right? Some of the advice that, like, let's say your aunties or your parents are giving you, might not be relevant for what's really happening in the world that you're trying to enter into, right? The world has evolved. So, but understand like where that's rooted. Sometimes it's tradition, sometimes it's safety. So understand what the underlying dynamic is so that you can respectfully work with it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that makes complete sense. I think there's some work that we should do. We're not putting all the pressure on the immigrant or you as a person. Of course, there's changes with the organization that needs to happen.
Right.
But there's also that realization that we also have some work to do on our
Mm-hmm.
own part.
Yes.
All right. The other one that I want to wrap up with that I was eager to get to is around food. My guests
Ooh.
are from different countries, so and we all like food, and food is the way to break the ice and get to meet people. So, if you were to share a dish from Japan,
Mm.
from Okinawa, in the US, a dish, a snack, tell us
Mm-hmm.
something that comes to mind and why.
So I'd say the snack or actually the dish that I miss the most, there's two of them actually. One is Okinawa soba. So it's like soba, but Okinawans are like really big on pork. So there's kind of a pork broth, base plus noodles plus like, slabs of like, you know, um, tender pork that has been like, cooked for hours, with some like fish cakes and some green onions and a little bit of ginger. And I miss that a lot because I really have not been able to replicate that here, right? Um, there's another thing another dish, and it's very simple. It's called champuru, and it's a stir fry. But there's something about the way it's done in Okinawa that just makes it taste so much better than like the way
It's
it's tasted,
different.
the way or the way I make it. So,
That's what I was going to
um,
say. Like, can you make that?
I make it, but I'm just like,
It's not
but
the
I go back,
same.
yeah, and I'm like crying tears of joy whenever I go back and have those dishes.
I know. Well, I'm glad you get to go back. I'm glad you have your memories, and I'm glad that you packaged all of your experiences, right, to helping others in the work that you do. And I'm looking forward to hearing more about your work.
Yeah,
Victoria, thank you so much for being here.
and thank you so much for inviting me, Lola.
Thank you for joining me, Lola Adeyemo, as always, for these important conversations on the corporate world of work from the immigrant perspective. For more resources and upcoming events, please visit our website, www.immigrantsincorporate.org. You can also follow us on Instagram at immigrantsincorporate. If you are on LinkedIn, please join the group Thriving in Intersectionality Immigrants Incorporate America. There will be a new episode every week, so make sure you are subscribed to get notified. Please leave us a rating, leave a review, and I hope to see you next time. Thank you.